Welcome, everyone. Today I have the pleasure of interviewing Mr. Mallory Gilbert, who I've known for about 10 years. And I am Roy Massaros. This is an effort by the Society of Wetland Scientists. This is a wetland interview that we're doing. So Mr. Gilbert has more than 45 years of professional work experience in natural resources management, agronomy, wetland sciences, soil science, field biology and ecology, and plant sciences. He has coordinated and or contributed significantly to a wide variety of environmental projects throughout the continental states, Alaska, and overseas. He's worked in both the public and private sectors for a diverse clientele, including government agencies, nonprofit entities, corporations, and individuals. Since 1975, he has taught college-level courses in soil science, agronomy, wetland ecology and delineation, hydrology of wetland systems, wetlands, construction, and natural resources management. Mr. Gilbert retired from the U.S. Air Force Reserve in 2004 at the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, having served 9 consecutive years as the commander of the 911th Civil Engineer Squadron headquartered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I first met Mr. Gilbert through Rutgers Education and Outreach, which he also continually does. So I've had the pleasure of working with him, studying with him, knowing him for 10 years, and it is my privilege to be able to do a wetland interview with him today. So welcome. If you're ready to go, I'll start with the first question. I'd like to make this basically where we want to direct it. I have some seed questions I'll start with, but let's take the discussion where you're comfortable with. We have 30 minutes because I want to stick to our time limit that we have. Okay. So if you're ready, I'll go with the first question. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Roy, and it's always been a pleasure working with you as well, so thank you.
I want to mention that you work extremely well with your students, and you're very gracious, humble, and you're just a nice person to learn from, and I appreciate everything that you've done for my career in helping me with what I've done for the Army Corps of Engineers, my day job, and learning from your programs. Thank you. So okay. Question number 1.
We can end it right there. Go right ahead.
Pretty much. Question number 1. The obvious question, how did you start your career in wetland science?
Oh my, and again, this goes back about 5 decades or so. Realistically, I think I got started initially when I did my first couple of soil probes when I was an undergraduate and then graduate student at the University of Connecticut. And these were hand-dug soil probes to a depth of anywhere between 48 and 72 inches, in which I got to describe the soil profile with a very experienced soil scientist and professor at UConn. It was essentially Ed Rubens, and a person for whom I had quite a bit of respect over the years. But in any event, what he pointed out to me in describing these soil probes was various features in the soils back then that we called mottling. And nowadays, of course, we refer to these things as being reduxomorphic features in soils. And I was fascinated by the fact that the soils would actually create these little morphological clues and indicators as to where seasonally high groundwater table was. So I was essentially hooked at that point in time on the soils aspect of hydrology and how water moved in soil. So I think that's where I really got started. But and professionally in graduate school, as I finished up my master's degree in 1974-75, I was actually hired as an assistant for a program that was being run by Dr. Michael LaFour at the University of Connecticut, and they were looking at inland wetlands in the state of Connecticut back at that time. We did actually have a definition of wetlands in Connecticut early on in the 1970s. It was mostly from the standpoint of trying to regulate and protect them from further damage. So there were the coastal wetlands and there were also the inland wetlands. But in the program I was working with LaFour on, we were essentially hired to identify wetlands or areas that could qualify as wetlands based primarily on soil characteristics, being very poorly drained, in some cases somewhat poorly drained soils that could actually be mapped as wetlands. So we did near infrared color photography, aerial photography of the town of Mansfield at that time. And then using the remote sensing data, we would identify areas that appeared to be wet on the landscape. And then it was up to me and a couple of other students that didn't mind the mosquitoes and the snakes and the other nasty things to actually go out and investigate those areas that we'd identified on the aerial photos. So that's really where I kind of got involved in this initially. And that was a very interesting project, and one that kind of introduced me to the whole concept of the ecological aspects of wetlands, being not only vegetative, the hydrologic aspects, certainly the soils, but how it all fit together in the landscape to support other functions, both on the landscape as well as in the forested areas around some of these vernal pools that we're looking at in Mansfield, Connecticut. So, I mean, that's really where I pretty much got started in that aspect. But just moving down the road relatively quickly, after the Vietnam War kind of came to an end, I pretty much stepped out of my active duty role with the Air Force. I was in the Reserve Officer Training Program, served briefly on active duty 1974-75, and then came back, wrapped up my master's degree, was going to go to State University of New York to actually pursue my PhD. And at that point in time, the whole Nixon administration and everything else was coming unglued. And funding for some of these federal projects that I was going to work on at SUNY essentially just fell out the bottom. So that my funding for my PhD program no longer existed. And I kind of had to scramble relatively quickly to find some way to keep food on the table. I went to work initially as an agricultural extension agent for the University of Connecticut, working with commercial growers of vegetable crops, as well as some dairy operations, and also horticultural operations, producing horticultural plants for sale throughout the state of Connecticut. So that's where I really got started there. I was in that program for about a year when I was recruited by folks from the U.S. Department of Agriculture Soil Conservation Service. They were actually looking for people to actually go out and do some of these field projects for them. And I was hired at that point in time as a soil conservationist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So that's really where my career more or less got started, where I got really involved professionally in doing hydrologic analysis, doing actual design of conservation practices in the field, working with farmers, looking at areas out on the landscape that we're hoping to improve for agricultural production. This is where I guess I have true confession time. I should go into the little confession booth with someone and say majority of our work at that time was actually involved in draining wetlands. we were, in essence, as ag people, were trying to make fields more arable for agricultural crops. So a wet spot out in the field would be something we try to get rid of. So any event, a lot of the work that I did back then did involve hydrology, did involve soils, certainly involved an understanding of the landscape. And it just evolved really from that point in time. The thing that was really interesting about the U.S. Department of Agriculture is they did give us plenty of opportunity to be trained with qualified engineers to design and construct various conservation practices. Everything from ponds and agricultural waste management systems to diversions to tile drainage systems. Certainly looking at the soils on these sites in terms of how they would affect the structural integrity of the things that we're building. So it was just a great place to get hydrology education, basic engineering education, certainly surveying is that's one of the places I picked up some of my better surveying skills for field surveying with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And that just more or less evolved over the next couple of years to the point where I was out with a farmer one day working on an agricultural application for him. He wanted to build an irrigation pond. And he turned to me and he said, well, you know, if we build this pond, can you guarantee that it's going to have plenty of water for me to irrigate my crops, for me to water my livestock? And if it's not going to have the capability to be full all year round, when is it likely to draw down and how much? And my answer to him at that point in time was, I'll get back to you on that. So that was pretty much an introduction to me in terms of looking at water budgets and, you know, trying to predict and do predictive analysis of how hydrology might be modified on the landscape, increasing the size of the watershed coming to the pond to increase the amount of runoff coming in so we could sustain the volumes of water we're looking for, and so on and so forth. So I really kind of credit that farmer, I guess, with turning me towards an interest in applied hydrology per se. And that also kind of made the jump from that agricultural setting. A few years later, we were doing a national inventory for natural resources for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And we had to actually map and identify areas on the landscape that included wetlands, forested areas, other urban areas, and so forth. I was standing in the middle of a wetland. I think it was somewhere up in central Vermont at the time. And what dawned on me at that point in time was, you know, why does this wetland present the way it presents in the landscape? What is the driving force that is responsible for the hydrology, or pardon me, for the vegetation and the expression of the hydrology on this site? And ultimately, you know, this led me to start doing actual water budgets for wetland sites. So I kind of jumped from the agricultural setting into more of a natural resources setting at that time. And by the way, that's Dr. Fauci that wants me. I cannot turn off my email alerts.
I was hoping it wasn't me, and it wasn't. So
no, it wasn't. Fine. But in any event, long story short, with all of that, is that was pretty much where I got involved or engaged in this concept of looking at hydrologic analysis for perhaps restoring and replacing and constructing wetland sites on the landscape. That was circa 1984, 85, 86 timeframe. And subsequent to that, my dear spouse finished her PhD at Dartmouth. She was awarded a muscular dystrophy fellowship at Penn State University. And I just said, oh, that's great. We can just pick up from Vermont and move to central Pennsylvania. There's 60 open positions in the government there right now where I can just move right back into the ag role as a U.S. Department of Agriculture conservationist. And lo and behold, that was the height of the Graham Rudman's Hollings federal government shutdown at that time, where all these agricultural positions had essentially been frozen. So my dear spouse and I went to Penn State, and I did not have a job. So ultimately what I ended up doing is working in a local engineering company doing construction inspection. And lo and behold, the 1987 manual was released for delineation of wetlands at that time. And folks all of a sudden started deciding it was important to start regulating wetland permitting activities again. And there became a huge demand at that time for people that knew how to identify and delineate wetlands. Now, having had a background in forestry and botany, as well as the soil sciences, just pretty much fell into place. It was serendipitous for me at that point in time. So ultimately, I ended up leaving the small engineering firm, hung up my own shingle, and went out to work on my own as a consulting soils and wetland scientist back around 1987, 1988 timeframe. In concert with this, though, I also took on a number of active duty assignments with the Air Force, being a reserve officer. One of them in particular, in 1985-86, they asked me to go up and inspect the dew line radar stations that were in northern Alaska and above the Arctic Circle, and to look at them from the perspective of what can we do up here to protect these resources, enhance the resources that are on these sites. So it was really kind of interesting because I got to visit more than a dozen of these remote radar sites above the Arctic Circle and slightly below throughout the state of Alaska, including a little island out on the end of the Aleutian chain that was then known as Shemya, or Shemya Island, and has since been changed to some other name, I can't recall. But from that island on a clear day, we actually could see Russia. So that was when Sarah Palin and other folks say, well, I could see Russia from my back door. Well, actually we could from Shemya Island. But that was an awesome experience. I think that's one of the most rewarding experiences I've had, essentially working in natural resources. My first exposure to pergelic cryoqueps, meaning frozen soils, or the permafrost soils that are up there. We now reclassified them as being gelisols for being the frozen soils. So more than 40 years ago, the interesting thing is that many of the sites that I visited back then that were permanently frozen soils, unfortunately, have begun to melt. So some of that permafrost that was out there in these sites that I was visiting way back when is rapidly disappearing. So again, that raises the specter of other things that we're concerned about these days too. But just to continue along in this odd experience of being in wetland science, around 1988, 89 timeframe, I was asked by a number of continuing education programs out there to present training in wetland sciences to folks that were trained as ecologists, botanists, foresters, engineers, to identify wetlands in the field so that they could be aided in their permitting process. So I actually went to work at that point in time with the continuing education program at Rutgers. I also taught with the Penn State program, as well as SUNY, State University of New York. Even did a course or two for the folks out in Lincoln, Nebraska. So that was just a wonderful and very rewarding time. And as you've alluded to, Roy, in my experience of being an instructor, I think I learned as much from my students as I've done in the process of trying to educate them. So it's been a wonderful exchange of knowledge over the years, something I've certainly enjoyed.
When you talk about exchange of knowledge, I want to go back to, you learned from the farmer the concept about drawdown. I studied wetland science, and I studied it with you at Rutgers at continuing education classes when you brought to my attention drawdown, and now I share that information with my students at NYU and Stevens Institute, which is what I'm doing this semester right now. Just so you know, some of what you've bestowed upon me, I'm now sharing with future students that hopefully go out and do this work. We actually, coincidentally, through this discussion with my one seed question, you've talked through probably half the questions that I had. So you're doing a great job. You don't even need me to ask more questions because you're doing fine on your own. I don't know if you need me to ask another question. You want to pick up from where you just left off?
Well, I think I can kind of just continue to go down this path for a little bit longer. But one of the things I do want to point out in this entire process is that there's been so many people that I've met throughout the course of my career. Folks like Robin Lewis and Gary Pierce, and certainly Bill Mitch and Ralph Tyner, with whom I'm still teaching at Rutgers. Other folks in the field that I know truly are the legends. These are the giants of the program that have been out there for years and years. And I've been honored to work with those folks. Certainly don't feel that I'm on the same caliber as any of them. One of the other individuals that you have interviewed, I know, is Royal Gardner, and I kind of bumped into and met Royal many, many times, and just thought he was awesome in the fact that he'd been so engaged in these programs over the years, trying to protect the resources. From where I'm sitting, really good.
From where I'm sitting, you're very much in the same caliber and class of some of those names you just mentioned. I'm curious how you first started to work with Ralph Tyner, because I had both of you at the Rutgers training classes. How did you first meet him, and what were your project that you were working on with him, et cetera?
Well, actually, the project we were working on at the time, I think, was track and field at the University of Connecticut. Ralph and I both went to UConn as undergraduates, and he also worked for Michael LaFour in a related program on wetlands, but it was mostly coastal marine wetlands. And he was a year or two ahead of me in the program. But Ralph and I actually bumped into each other frequently throughout our, at least our athletic careers at UConn. Ralph was a football player, and in the off season, he'd come and train with the track team at UConn, and would also compete on behalf of the track team. So I was there as a guy that essentially did a lot of running and jumping and pole vaulting events, eventually leaning towards the decathlon. And I often tell folks that, yes, indeed, I did compete against Bruce Jenner years ago. And, even in high heel shoes, I'm sure that Caitlin could still beat me in the 100-yard dash. So that's a 100-meter dash in today's day. But bottom line is, it was mostly an athletic environment. So Ralph and I knew each other for years. He wandered off and ultimately went to work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Obviously a prolific author, and just very embedded in his knowledge of plants and remote sensing. Just a great guy to be working with. Ultimately, when the opportunity came up with Ralph and I to work together at Rutgers, the unfortunate part of that is that Ralph's career co-instructor at Rutgers had been Dr. Peter Veneman from the University of Massachusetts. And Pete, unfortunately, didn't succumb, but he certainly was hampered by Lyme disease. And as a result, he was unable to continue instructing. And Ralph, I think, in looking around for other people that might be able to work with him, noted that I was teaching courses at Rutgers anyway, and said, would you be interested in picking up the wetland hydric soils portion of the course? And so I jumped on, and Ralph and I have been together ever since. So we're still teaching that course, and neither of us are any younger, but we're still managing to get through it. So it's a fun course.
I was going to ask, but I didn't want to go too far off my scripted questions that I had prepared today. But you brought up Lyme disease, and a curious question I had, because there seems to be a lot of attention in the media with different things, typically bad things in media, never good things. Was 40 years ago, 4 or 5 decades ago, was Lyme disease something that occurred? I don't think it was really brought to light until about 25 years ago. You go ahead if you have some.
Well, that's pretty much the timeline. Folks were succumbing, having different issues related to, boy, my joints are aching. I tend to wake up at night with cold sweats. Just haven't felt well. They ended up going to see their physicians. Physicians couldn't diagnose at that time. And finally, when we got around to really understanding the disease, we realized it was a tick-borne illness. And of course, the knowledge of the disease became much better and acknowledged in the medical community, and also certainly potential treatments for it as well. Still probably not as, I think, universally accepted as a chronic illness. But I've known several people over the years that have had very, very serious outcomes as a result of Lyme. And some folks, in fact, unfortunately, have been in a situation where they are really seriously disabled.
Not to bring too much concern to our younger listeners today, I get tested for the Lyme titer once a year just because I spend time in the field. You probably spend more time in the field than I do, but it's prudent to get tested once a year. And when caught early, if you have these symptoms,
yes,
the bullseye rash that you catch, the earlier you catch it, the better off you are. I just want to make that public service announcement, because you have younger listeners that might be listening to this, and we have such a passion for wetland science. We're willing to take on some risk, including something like Lyme disease, which is maybe less of a risk these days because of what's known about it.
I agree. And I mean, we encounter all sorts of fun things when we're in the field, anything from venomous snakes to crocodiles and alligators. And unfortunately, I've had a personal experience with one of the crocodiles down in the Keys. So actually one that was basking in the sun as I kind of came around a little knob on one of these little sidewater mangrove areas. And to this day, the hairs still can go up on the back of my neck thinking about that one.
Understandably, your war stories you've got more of them, more severe than mine, but coincidentally, I was with you on a site visit with one of those training classes. I had sprayed tick repellent all over me, and I think you're standing next to me or walking in the field, and there was a tick crawling up my arm that had that spray all over it. So spray only works so much before it doesn't work.
Well, that's true. And again, I think all we can do is really stress due diligence. Right. We deal with mosquitoes, some mosquito-borne illnesses. We deal with chiggers. We deal with ticks, certainly. I think the deal is just have a regular protocol. Inspect yourself as you're in the field, and certainly when you get out of the field, strip down. Make sure you carefully inspect yourself for any of these little critters. If you do have one that's attached, don't ignore it. You may actually be in a position where you can essentially get treatment very early. And not everyone, by the way, has the bullseye rash. I do, unfortunately. When I get bitten now, I don't even have to have the tick on for more than 15, 20 minutes. Once it breaks my skin, even before it's capable of transmitting the disease, I have a histamine reaction where I will just swell up like a bee sting. So, I mean, it's very easy for me to know now when I have tech issues, but, again, we do not want to scare people. This is a wonderful science. It's a great place to interface with the environment and all sorts of wonderful functions in the landscape. I firmly believe that this is one of the better places on the planet where we can, truly see the impact of organisms on water quality, and certainly on the diversity of the organisms that occupy the planet. So it's just a wonderful, wonderful science.
Agreed. Along that line of discussion, I wanted to ask a question about projects you've implemented, and all of them have a society and community benefit. But any of them stand out that you'd want to talk about in the short time that we have, that projects you've implemented that had societal or community benefit? I mean, all wetlands have a community benefit, but something that stands out to you as being really a gem that you've been involved with.
Well, there's been a couple of sites where I've been involved in wetland restoration and construction projects where we've really had fundamental shifts in the essentially the efficacy of the wetland functions that have been associated with the sites. One that I really kind of stands out in my mind, Rob Brooks from Penn State University. Rob unfortunately passed fairly recently here. It was a series of wetlands that were constructed in a 100-acre site near Penn State University. We built 50 acres of wetlands on that site, and Rob, as part of the graduate school training, had folks monitoring those wetlands for many, many years. And the thing that he shared with me on a number of occasions is that from a purely functional standpoint, and the metrics that could be applied that they'd been using at the Penn State University to essentially measure the functionality of wetlands, the wetlands that we'd actually constructed were functioning at a higher level than the reference wetlands that were in the vicinity. So from that perspective, I've been very, very satisfied with that particular experience. But I'll digress one more time here too and state that I think it's the work that I've done with wetland hydrology, in particular developing very rudimentary models for predictive hydrographs for sites that have been very rewarding to me. Michael Rollband, one of our colleagues and friends who took this a little bit further, is now a professor of practice at Cornell, semi-retired from his business, which was wetland studies. I can't recall. Yeah, I think it was Wetland Studies and Solutions. But in any event, Michael and his work had taken the initial rudimentary Excel programs that we put together simply to do hydrographs, and has essentially morphed that into a program now which is called WetBud. This is a wetland water budget training platform that can be used. It was done with Virginia Tech, Old Dominion University, and other very qualified academics putting together these programs. So that's been very rewarding to me to now have something that the Army Corps has actually grabbed onto and said, WetBud is a good program. We should encourage folks to use this. So that's been very rewarding as well.
WetBud is available online like everything else. Is there a cost associated with that, or you download it and use it?
Right now, I believe you can there's no cost involved. It can be downloaded and it can be used. It's still pretty much in what we call the beta testing phase, but it is certainly applicable to some of the more simple sites that are out there. And the one thing that it has a little bit more of than we taught initially at Rutgers is it looks very closely at the way water moves through soil in the subgrade and substrates of wetland systems. It's something that we never really could get our heads around completely in the hydrograph preparation programs that we put together initially, but they've taken it one step further and are looking very closely at that now as well. So again, that's been very rewarding to me.
Excellent. We have time for a little bit more discussion. One of the things I definitely wanted to get to, because these interviews I'm hoping inspire future wetland scientists, if you're not already one. What could you talk about to help inspire, motivate students that are maybe now involved with academics, undergrad or graduate? Just something that you could offer that would inspire folks to keep going with their career in wetland science, et cetera.
Well, again, I think it gets back around to the fact that if the ethic is there where someone is inspired to do something positive for the planet, this is one of the places where you can have a pretty significant impact, not only in saving the resources, but perhaps in restoring them and bringing them back and even recreating them in certain landscape positions. So from that standpoint, it can be extremely rewarding. The other thing I will point out about being in an undergraduate or graduate environment at this point in time is, 40, 50 years ago, when we were trying to wander down this path and ultimately ended up in calling ourselves wetland scientists, we didn't really have wetland specific courses that we could go to at that time. Many of the major academic institutions that are out there right now really have excellent undergraduate and graduate programs which are specifically targeted on wetland science. So from that standpoint, you can be educated far more specifically rather than, when I took a course, God, I think it was I don't even want to go back there, but I think it was 1971 or 72. It was called Field Ecology. And it was a 5-credit course that took up almost a third of my academic credits for that particular semester that I was taking. It was really, really complex. But for all intents and purposes, we were looking at field ecological aspects, and they always kept wandering back to wet places on the landscape. So it's always very interesting to me that we start with the soil, we start with then move up into the hydrologic regime, and then we actually start looking at the organisms on the landscape and how they're all interacting. And quite frankly, I think it's just awesome to have this kind of academic suite of coursework available to folks nowadays. So, I mean, you can really set a path and you can follow it. If I were to encourage a student nowadays to actually have something specific in their resume as they get ready to go out to try to find a job, I would really strongly encourage GPS, GIS, the ability to actually go to the field and use some of these technologies in the field for mapping. Extremely important. There's a lot of folks out there that need those services immediately. And it may not be just for wetland boundaries. It may be for many, many other aspects of consulting, engineering, and so forth. Also in the federal government and in the state governments, there are positions open for folks that are interested in wetland sciences as well. So the career itself is opened up. There's a great opportunity here to benefit humanity, and everything from even doing urban stormwater management systems with wetland components that end up polishing runoff water. It's just a great way to improve the planet.
It's interesting you discussed what you've just did, and I'm at NYU, and NYU's done a great job with a class called Green Infrastructure, which is essentially stormwater management current trends, and then another class called Wetland Design for Water Quality Improvement. So the whole idea of wetlands and what you've just talked about is how wetlands benefit humanity and improve water quality, which is what you just touched on. I think we have time. I don't want to go too far over because we're on a schedule, and I don't want to cause problems for anybody sticking to the schedule that they told us we should stick to. I suppose you're so easy to interview because I don't even need to be here. Right through this. So that's been great. Thank you for that. Something that you might comment about current projects you're involved with, one or two, or maybe just one. Talk about a current project that you're involved with, where it is and its benefits, values, etc.
Okay, well, I think I'm wrapping up right now a couple of projects. Obviously, at this point in my career, I'm trying to minimize the amount of field work I'm doing these days. I still do quite a bit, and as I say, when we're teaching at Rutgers, we have quite a bit of interaction in the field with students too. But in particular, I don't want to name names here, but I've been working on a constructed wetland site now over in Ohio, where we've been trying to reestablish a cluster and forested environment over time. And I think one of the things that comes just clearly into focus for me in this entire process is that when we go out into the landscape and we disturb the environment in order to make a wetland or to construct a wetland site, we've set into play a whole series of Darwinian processes, which sets up essentially challenges and counter challenges. Getting back to the seminal work of Dr. Paul Ketty, understanding that there's various filters in the landscape that will allow certain organisms to persist. And that site in particular, for me, I've been now monitoring it and working on that site for more than 10 consecutive years, watching its development over time and watching these various interactions of the different suites of vegetation, the organisms that are on the site, the fluctuations in the hydrology, the drawdown, the drought periods, the excess hydrology. It's been awesome because you can actually see so many of these environmental theories that folks have espoused for years actually in play. So for me, that's been very, very rewarding to watch this go forward. And by the way, the site is actually working its way towards being clustered and forested, but it's hard to do in 10 years. It's certainly on a trajectory, but it's you know, one of those things that I don't think we can truly get our heads around in a short period of time.
Excellent. You've been such a great individual to interview with, and I would love to go on for another hour or two, but we're supposed to keep this to about 30 minutes, which I think we've succeeded at doing that. I can't thank you enough for your time. I know how busy you are, and I think I said at the onset how gracious you are. That might have been the word I used. You're certainly gracious. You prove that here. The fact that you've got such great history and knowledge to share with us is what's really appreciated. So I want to thank you for your time, and look forward to hearing this. And it'll be posted on the SWS website, I hope, in a couple of weeks. And with that, is there anything else you want to just close with, or give you an opportunity to say anything else? Say again?
Yes, thank you so much, Roy. And again, I appreciate the invitation, and I do apologize for the verbal diarrhea. Quite frankly, the point is that, you know, if just looking back over 40 years, almost 50 years now, it's really hard to zero in on any one thing. But again, I'll just get back to the people, the knowledge, the way the science has evolved in the last 40, 50 years has been amazing. And I've been honored just to be able to sit back and observe it. So thank you.